안녕하세요. 오늘 날씨 참 좋네요. 이런 날은 어디론가 훌쩍 떠나고 싶지만 저희는 오늘도 여러분과 함께 비트코인 이야기를 나눠보려고 합니다.
네, 반갑습니다. 특히 얼마 전에 끝난 비트코인 서울 2025 컨퍼런스 정말 열기가 대단했죠.
맞아요. 그래서 혹시 현장에 못 가셨거나 그 핵심 내용을 다시 한번 좀 정리하고 싶다. 이런 분들을 위해서 저희가 좀 중요한 내용을 꼽아왔습니다.
네, 특히 저희가 참고한 자료 중에 세계의 파도가 물고 오는 하나의 미래라는 리포트가 있는데요. 혹시 시간이 되시면 이걸 먼저 읽어보시면 오늘 저희 이야기가 훨씬 더 재미있을 거예요.
좋은 정보네요. 워낙 그 컨퍼런스에서 다른 내용이 많았지만 오늘은 그중에서도 특히 기관 투자자들이 정말 많이 궁금해하는 거, 바로 비트코인 커스터디 세션을 좀 깊게 파보려고 합니다.
커스터디요?
네, 비트코인 ETF 승인 이후에 이게 더 중요해졌잖아요.
맞아요. 저도 자료 보면서 이 커스터디가 진짜 기관들이 들어오는데 핵심 열쇠 같다는 생각이 들더라고요.
근데 이게 우리가 그냥 은행에 돈 맡기는 거랑은 좀 다르다고 하던데요? 정확히 어떤 서비스인가요?
네, 그게 아주 중요한 포인트인데요. 우리가 보통 은행 생각하면 고객 돈을 받아서 운용까지 하는 신탁업을 떠올리잖아요.
네네.
근데 비트코인 커스터디는 조금 달라요. 비트코인 그 자체를 금고에 넣듯 보관하는 게 아니고요. 그 비트코인의 소유권, 이걸 증명하는 개인키, 프라이빗키라고 하죠. 이걸 안전하게 대신 관리하고 보관해주는 서비스예요.
개인 키를요?
네. 그러니까 수탁업에 더 가깝다고 봐야죠. 비트코인은 사실 블록체인 위에 기록되는 거니까요.
아하, 그 키를 안전하게 지켜주는 거군요. 근데 그러면 개인 투자자들은 사실 그냥 거래소에 코인 두는 경우 많잖아요.
그렇죠.
근데 왜 기관들은 굳이 비용까지 내가면서 이 커스터디 서비스를 이용해야 하는 걸까요? 이게 개인하고는 필요성 자체가 다른 건가요?
네, 그렇습니다. 개인한테는 거래소가 편리하고 충분할 수 있죠. 근데 수백억, 수천억 이렇게 큰 자금을 다루는 기관 입장에서는 이게 얘기가 완전히 달라져요. 크게 두 가지 이유가 있습니다.
두 가지요?
네. 첫째는 소유권의 명확성, 이게 중요해요. 거래소 계좌에 찍힌 잔고는 어떻게 보면 그냥 데이터베이스 기록일 수 있거든요.
그럴 수 있겠네요.
하지만 커스터디는 고객별로 독립된 지갑 주소를 딱 만들어서 온체인, 그러니까 블록체인상에 직접 기록된 잔고로 소유권을 아주 확실하게 증명해 줍니다.
블록체인에 직접 기록되니까 논란의 여지가 없겠군요. 그럼 두 번째 이유는 뭔가요?
바로 관리의 투명성하고 내부 통제입니다. 생각해 보세요. 수백억 자산을 특정 직원 한두 명이 관리한다? 이건 내부 통제상으로 보면 엄청난 위험이죠.
그렇죠. 사고 나면 큰일이니까.
네. 커스터디 서비스는 이 자산을 조회하는 권한, 또 출금을 요청하고 승인하는 절차, 이런 것들을 여러 단계로 나누고 또 기업의 필요에 맞게 딱 설정할 수가 있어요. 아주 체계적인 통제 시스템을 제공하는 거죠.
그래서 금융당국에서도 법인이 가상자산 보유할 때는 제3자 커스터디를 쓰라고 권고하는 거군요.
네, 바로 그런 이유 때문입니다.
그렇군요. 결국 이런 안정적인 커스터디 인프라가 없이는 비트코인 현물 ETF 같은 상품은 아예 상상하기 어렵겠네요.
정확합니다. 혹시라도 FTX 사태 같은 일이 또 벌어져서 운용사나 거래소가 파산해도 내 자산은 안전하게 분리돼서 보호받는다. 이런 신뢰가 있어야 하잖아요.
네, 신뢰가 중요하죠.
이 신뢰가 바로 대중화 그리고 기관 투자 유치의 정말 핵심적인 기반입니다. 커스터디는 비트코인이 그냥 어떤 기술적인 호기심을 넘어서 이제 제도권 금융자산으로 딱 자리 잡기 위한 필수 인프라인 셈이죠.
그럼 요즘 기관들이 이 커스터디 관련해서 제일 궁금해하는 거, 좀 실질적인 질문들은 어떤 게 있을까요? 예전에는 어떻게 사요? 이런 걸 물었다면 지금은 좀 더 구체적인 고민들을 할 것 같은데요.
맞습니다. 질문의 결이 확실히 달라졌어요. 초기에는 말씀하신 것처럼 매수 방법, 그다음에는 회계 처리 어떻게 하냐 이걸 주로 물었다면요. 최근에는 실제 계좌 개설 절차나 공시 방법, 이런 아주 실무적인 부분을 많이들 궁금해하세요.
정말 실무 레벨로 내려왔네요.
네, 그리고 또 어떤 코인을 얼마나 사야 하는지, 또 회사 내부에서 투자 결정은 어떤 프로세스로 해야 하는지, 이것도 큰 고민거리입니다. 다행히 금융당국에서 이제 상장사 대상으로 가이드라인을 거의 다 만들고 있다고 하니까요. 회계나 공시 문제는 곧 해결될 것 같습니다.
다행이네요.
다만 국내 거래소 유동성만으로 기관들이 원하는 만큼 대규모 매매가 가능할까? 이 부분에 대한 우려는 아직 좀 남아있죠.
유동성 문제, 그것도 중요하겠네요. 혹시 비트코인을 맡겨두면 은행 예금처럼 이자 같은 게 붙거나 뭐 수량이 늘어나는 그런 서비스도 가능한가요?
그 부분도 질문 많이 하시는데요. 현재로서는 좀 어렵습니다. 우리나라 특정금융정보법, 보통 특금법이라고 부르죠.
네.
이 법하고 또 최근에 시행된 가상자산 이용자 보호법 1단계에서는요. 고객 자산을 받은 그대로, 그러니까 동일 종리, 동일 수량으로만 보관하도록 강제하고 있어요.
받은 그대로만?
네. 그래서 자산을 굴려서 이자를 주거나 하는 행위는 지금은 금지됩니다. 그나마 지분증명, POS 코인의 스테이킹 정도가 예외적으로 가능하긴 한데 이것도 좀 제한적이고요.
그렇군요.
하지만 올해 하반기에 이용자 보호법 2단계 입법 논의가 있거든요. 그때 가상자산 운용업이 포함될 가능성이 있어서 앞으로는 규제 틀 안에서 다양한 수익 창출 서비스가 나올 여지는 있습니다. 좀 지켜봐야죠.
그렇군요. 기대해 볼 만하겠네요. 그러면 국내 커스터디 업체들, 인프라는 좀 충분한 수준일까요? 아무래도 코인베이스 프라임 같이 글로벌 공룡들에 비하면 아직 규모가 좀 작다는 걱정도 있거든요.
네, 그 부분도 사실 중요한 지점이죠. 기술 수준이나 관리 시스템 자체는 글로벌 수준에 거의 근접했다고 봐요. 하지만 솔직히 말씀드리면 자본금 규모라던가 보험 가입 한도, 또 전문 인력 같은 외형적인 인프라는 아직 부족한 게 현실입니다.
아무래도 좀 차이가 있겠죠?
네. 과거에는 법인 시장 자체가 거의 없었으니까 선제적으로 대규모 투자를 하기가 어려웠던 탓이죠. 하지만 이제 시장이 열리고 있으니까 신탁사 수준으로 자본금도 늘리고 보험 가입도 확대하려고 노력하고 있습니다. 기준을 맞추려고 애쓰고 있는 거죠.
네.
그리고 또 하나 생각해 볼 점은 거래소가 직접 커스터디를 운영하는 게 과연 괜찮은가 하는 이해상충 문제? 또 국내 자산이 자꾸 해외로 빠져나가는 걸 막기 위해서라도 국내 커스터디 산업을 키워야 한다는 목소리도 있고요. 이것도 중요한 논의 지점입니다.
네, 오늘 비트코인 서울 2025 커스터디 세션을 통해서 이 비트코인이 제도권으로 들어서는 과정에서 안전한 보관 문제가 왜 이렇게 중요하게 떠오르는지 그 이유를 좀 깊이 있게 살펴본 것 같습니다. 결국 기관 참여를 이끌어내려면 이 신뢰와 투명성 확보가 핵심이라는 생각이 드네요.
맞습니다. 저도 이번 세션을 보면서 느낀 게 단순히 기술적인 문제를 넘어서서 법과 제도를 통해서 어떻게 신뢰를 구축하고 또 시장을 건강하게 키워나갈 것인가, 이 고민이 정말 중요하다는 걸 다시 한번 느꼈습니다. 그리고 동시에 우리 한국 시장도 나름대로 체계적으로 준비를 잘 해나가고 있다는 인상도 받았고요.
저 역시 이 개인 키 관리라는 어떻게 보면 되게 기술적인 문제가 단순히 보안 이슈를 넘어서서 금융 시스템 전체의 변화, 그리고 대중화를 위한 정말 필수적인 연결고리가 되는구나 하는 점이 굉장히 흥미롭게 다가왔습니다.
마지막으로 여러분께 이런 질문을 한번 던져보고 싶습니다. 기관 투자자들이 이제 커스터디 서비스를 통해서 대규모로 시장에 들어오는 이 흐름 속에서 과연 not your keys, not your coins, 즉 개인이 직접 자기 키를 관리하면서 주권을 행사한다는 비트코인 본연의 탈중앙화 정신은 어떻게 될까요? 이 두 거대한 흐름이 앞으로 어떻게 공존하고 또 진화해 나갈지 이걸 지켜보는 것도 아주 흥미로운 관전 포인트가 될 것 같습니다.
네, 오늘 저희의 이야기가 여러분의 지적인 탐험에 즐거운 자극이 되었기를 바랍니다. 다음 시간에도 더 흥미로운 내용으로 찾아뵙겠습니다. 감사합니다.
감사합니다.
Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're doing a special deep dive, looking back at a really key session from Bitcoin Seoul 2025. It was called The Imperative of Secure Bitcoin Custody in Korea. And honestly, it shed light on so much. So our mission here is really for you listening. Maybe you couldn't make it to the conference, or maybe you were there and just want a good, solid review of the main points. Think of this as your quick guide to understanding where virtual assets are headed in Korea. It's moving fast.
Yeah, and the timing's interesting, isn't it? You've got the new government making big moves on virtual asset policy. We're hearing about Bitcoin ETFs potentially being allowed, talk of a one-base stablecoin and STO framework. It's a lot.
Yeah.
And all this push towards institutions getting involved, it's really put a spotlight on one critical piece of infrastructure, custody. Suddenly, everyone's talking about it. So to help us sort through all this and really connect the dots on why custody is such a big deal right now, we've got our expert guide to the material with us.
Glad to be here. It's definitely a topic that's crucial, but often, misunderstood in the broader virtual asset conversation.
Great. So let's start right at the beginning. Custody. It sounds like something from traditional banking, right? But what does it actually mean in the virtual asset world? How's it different?
That's the perfect place to start. And yeah, it came up a lot at Bitcoin Soul. People often think it's just, storing Bitcoin. But what it really boils down to is the service of securely holding the private keys, those secret codes, essentially, that prove you own the Bitcoin or whatever asset it is on the blockchain. Without those keys, you don't have control. Simple as that. Now, comparing it to traditional finance, yes, it's similar in that someone's managing assets for you, but in Korean legal terms, virtual asset custody is very specifically focused on storage. It's more like a deposit business or dijal. That's different from a trust business, or all, which might involve, say, operating or lending out the assets. Right now, as was really emphasized at the conference, Korean virtual asset custody is strictly about safekeeping, not about generating yield through active management.
Okay, that distinction makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about, well, past market blowups. But most people, individuals anyway, just keep their crypto on an exchange. It seems easy enough. So why is this specialized custody thing so vital for businesses? Why can't they just do the same?
That's a huge point and a major focus at the session. For companies, using an exchange like an individual does, well, it just doesn't cut it. As someone at the conference put it, it's like trying to run a major corporation using just a personal bank account. It lacks the necessary controls and features. There are, I'd say, three main reasons why businesses need specialized custody. First up is transparency of ownership. When you see your balance on an exchange, often that's just a number in their database. It's not always directly verifiable on the blockchain as yours. Exchanges tend to pool client assets in their own large wallets. Custody providers, on the other hand, create specific wallets for each client. The balance you see on chain is demonstrably the company's asset. And that's absolutely critical for things like corporate accounting, audits, proving ownership to regulators like the FSC here in Korea.
Right, the auditors need that clear, verifiable link.
Exactly. Second, and this is huge for companies dealing with large sums, maybe tens of billions of won, is internal control and management convenience. An exchange account is usually just one login. How do you manage internal approvals? Custody services are built for this. They offer things like multi-stage approvals for withdrawals. Maybe you need 2, 3, even 5 different people to sign off, depending on the company's policy. It's customizable. Plus, you can set different permission levels. Some staff might only get view-only access. Others can initiate withdrawals. Others approve. It creates accountability, an audit trail. Exchanges just don't offer that level of sophistication.
Makes sense. Much more robust.
And the third reason, which really seemed to hit home for the institutional folks at the conference, is the regulatory imperative. Regulators, like Korea's Financial Services Commission, are increasingly suggesting, or even mandating, that listed companies use third-party custody if they hold virtual assets. It's moving from being a good idea to practically an obligation. They see the risks of companies holding assets directly and want that professional separation. Which, as we talked about, raises a big question, doesn't it? What does this signal for corporations jumping into the virtual asset space, say, in the next 6 months or so?
That regulatory angle really connects to the buzz around Bitcoin ETFs and more institutions getting involved. We heard so much about that. So how does custody, which sounds like it's mainly for these big players, actually become the key, the game changer for mass adoption by everyone?
Oh, it's absolutely fundamental. Professional custody is crucial for bringing the wider public in and building that institutional trust.
Yeah.
How? By basically de-risking the whole system.
Right.
We all remember collapses like FTX, right? A key takeaway from the session was how professional custody clearly separates client assets from the institution's own operational funds. This separation drastically reduces systemic risk. If the custodian or exchange has problems, client assets held properly in custody should, in theory, be safe and separate. That builds huge public confidence.
That separation is vital, definitely.
It is, and it lowers the barrier to entry.
Yeah.
Think about it. A lot of people are interested in crypto, but maybe aren't tech experts. They're nervous about managing their own keys, the security aspects. Professional custody lets them participate more safely, trusting experts with the secure storage part. And ultimately, for Bitcoin to really reach its potential, some talk about it matching or exceeding gold's market cap, which would mean maybe 10-fold, 12-fold growth from here.
Yeah.
It needs to go beyond the early adopters. It needs mainstream acceptance. Custody provides that trusted, secure infrastructure, making it accessible, much like how gold ETFs opened up that market.
It really does sound like the hidden plumbing that makes the whole system work for wider adoption. So, speaking of companies getting ready, what are the actual questions they're asking right now? Are they asking how to buy, or are the questions more sophisticated now?
It's fascinating how the questions have changed. Based on, advising hundreds of companies since 2021, something discussed among the experts at Bitcoin Seoul, the evolution is clear. Back in 2021, during that bull run, the main question was literally, how do we buy Bitcoin? Exchanges weren't really set up for corporate accounts then due to specific rules. Some companies were desperate. Then in 2022, with the NFT boom, it shifted. Less about Bitcoin, more about other assets for projects. The big question became, how do we handle the accounting for these NFTs or other tokens? That was a real headache. Are they intangible assets? Revenue.
Right. Completely new territory for accounting departments.
It's exactly. But now, the top questions are surprisingly practical, focused on compliance. Things like, how do we actually open a corporate account for virtual assets? And how do we make sure we're following the accounting disclosure rules? On the accounting side, it's interesting the Financial Supervisory Service here actually put out guidance for listed companies way back in December 2021. So the framework exists. Companies are just figuring out how to implement it. Another big practical worry we hear, and this sparked debate at the conference, is market liquidity. Korea has limited won-based crypto markets right now, and not much in the way of established OTC desks. So if a big company wants to buy, say, 10 or 20 billion won worth of Bitcoin, can the current exchanges even handle that size order without moving the price dramatically? That's a real concern.
Yeah, that's a practical hurdle.
Definitely. And from a, say, WaveBridge's perspective, we're seeing broader strategic questions too. Companies aren't just asking if anymore, but where to play. Should they focus on STOs, real-world assets, get into prime brokerage, focus on Bitcoin or Ethereum ETFs, or maybe treat Bitcoin like a treasury asset like MicroStrategy does? The what and how are the big questions now. And a huge pain point, honestly, universally felt, is internal controls around wallets. Managing those keys is tricky. Security gets weaker the more people know the details. But having just one person hold the keys, that's a massive single point of failure risk. What if they leave? Or worse?
And crypto transfers are irreversible.
Precisely. No undo button like in traditional finance. So companies are wrestling with how to manage wallet access securely, internally, without crippling themselves or opening up huge risks. And finally, there are still lots of questions around legal and tax clarity. How exactly should things be accounted for? What are the tax implications? Are there limits on how much they can invest? The good news, as we heard from regulators at the session, is that new legislation is coming. They're looking at the US, Japan, Hong Kong, learning lessons. And what's really striking is how proactive the Korean authorities seem to be. The FSC is apparently almost 90% done with comprehensive guidelines for listed companies on acquiring and managing virtual assets. That should provide a much clearer roadmap.
Wow, 90% done. That is proactive. It's actually reassuring to hear that level of preparation. But okay, let's talk returns. A common question must be, can you earn interest on Bitcoin held in custody, like a bank deposit? What did the session suggest about yield generation?
That's a really important question. And the answer right now under Korean rules is mostly no, with one main exception. The current law, the Specific Financial Transactions Act, is quite strict. It limits virtual asset service providers, VASPS, to basically three types: exchange, wallet service, and custody. And crucially, the Virtual Asset User Protection Act says providers have to keep client assets in identical type, identical quantity. This rule effectively prohibits operating client assets for yield. A custodian can't take your Bitcoin, lend it out, or use it in DeFi to earn interest because that might change its type or risk its quantity. That's not allowed.
So simple holding is the mandate.
Pretty much. The main exception right now is staking. That's generally considered permissible because, well, you're typically delegating voting power or locking assets, but not transferring ownership away from the custodian's control. The asset type and quantity remain fundamentally the same. And interestingly, for Bitcoin, which traditionally isn't staked like proof-of-stake coins, new ideas are popping up. Things like Core DAO or Babylon, which allow a form of Bitcoin staking by time-locking the Bitcoin without it actually moving. That was some cutting-edge stuff discussed.
Fascinating. So staking is the loophole, kind of. What about the future? Any changes expected?
Yes, there's definitely optimism there. The next stage of the Virtual Asset User Protection Act, which might come in the second half of this year, is expected to actually define what an operation business is in the virtual asset context. Once that's defined, it could potentially open the door for services more like, say, Coinbase Prime in the US, where custodians could partner with specialized operators to generate yield for clients. The business model could then shift from just charging a custody fee to earning an operating fee, closer to traditional finance models. But we need that regulatory clarity first.
Okay, so potential evolution there. But stepping back again, thinking about global competition, is Korea's custody infrastructure actually ready? Can it compete with the big international players like BitGo, Fireblocks, Coinbase Prime, especially if institutional demand really takes off?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? and it definitely sparked some lively discussion. On the technology and security management side, I genuinely believe Korean providers are rapidly becoming world-class. When the new act fully kicks in, these firms will face audits from the Financial Supervisory Service held to standards similar to banks. Companies like Kodier are already working to meet these very high bars, so technically, yes, they're capable.
I sense a but coming.
Well, the but is mainly around capital, scale, and resources. Let's be honest, the global leaders have massive capital backing, huge teams, extensive facilities, trillions of won in some cases. Korean providers are smaller right now, partly because the institutional market here was just starting. Kodier, for example, mentioned plans to significantly boost their capital and get insurance coverage up to maybe 100 billion won, aiming for that trust company level of assurance. Scaling up capital and insurance is key to winning the trust of really big institutions.
And what about how the market itself is structured?
Right, that's another factor. In Korea, you often see exchanges, like Upbid, offering custody as part of their service. It's convenient for users, maybe, but it mixes functions and can create systemic risks like commingling funds. The U.S. model, like Coinbase separating its exchange from its prime custody service, pushes for functional separation. And that's the direction regulators here and globally seem to prefer. There's a definite push to unbundle these services in Korea. This should lead to a more mature ecosystem with specialized independent custodians and prime brokers. It's better for risk management, better for trust.
Separation of duties, essentially.
Exactly. And finally, there's a sort of national interest angle that came up. Just like countries prefer to store their physical gold reserves domestically, there's an argument for having strong domestic custody for digital assets. It helps mitigate concerns about capital flight, though that's a complex debate, and builds a robust national financial infrastructure for this new asset class.
That makes sense. Wow, okay. It's clear that session at Bitcoin Seoul packed in a ton of crucial information. I really appreciate you helping us unpack it all. You know, reflecting on it, I found it genuinely fascinating just how much detailed, systematic planning seems to be happening behind the scenes with the regulators. They really seem to be trying to build guardrails before opening the floodgates. It feels more deliberate than maybe people realize.
I agree. And for me, the biggest takeaway from that session, and just observing the market, is the undeniable momentum. The move towards institutional and then mass adoption in Korea feels very real now. It's not just hype. It's being driven by genuine market needs and, importantly, by this thoughtful, proactive regulatory approach. It feels like Korea is really positioning itself carefully for this next phase. We're definitely on the verge of something significant here.
Absolutely. It really does feel that way. So, for everyone listening, as this landscape in Korea keeps maturing, blending virtual assets with traditional finance, what new opportunities or maybe even unexpected hurdles do you think might pop up for businesses and for individual investors? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into secure Bitcoin custody in Korea.